Two people walk into the same dealership in the same city during the same week, looking at the exact same car. One of them quietly loses over $2,000 without realizing it, and neither of them sees where it actually happened. By the time they leave, one of them believes he negotiated a great deal, while the other feels like he simply paid a fair price. And the uncomfortable part is that both of them feel like they made the right decision, which is exactly why the system works so well. Because the most expensive financial mistakes rarely feel like mistakes in the moment. They feel logical, justified, and even smart. And the difference between them was not the car, not the timing, and not even how hard they negotiated. It was how the system responded to the way they entered the deal. Daniel had been planning this purchase for months, not in a rushed or emotional way, but in the way people believe responsible decisions should be made: slow, informed, and controlled. He compared prices online, checked different dealerships, read reviews, watched breakdowns of the car he wanted. And by the time he walked into the showroom, he already had a number in his head that felt grounded in reality. The car he was looking at had a sticker price of around $31,800. And like most people who spend time preparing, he knew that the sticker price was not the real number. So when he sat down, he didn't ask if there was a better deal. He assumed there was, and immediately started negotiating. The conversation unfolded exactly the way it is designed to: not aggressive, not chaotic, but controlled, structured, almost rehearsed. The salesperson moved the numbers slowly, resisted just enough to make each concession feel meaningful, creating the impression that every $100 required effort, that every small win Daniel got was something he earned through persistence. And after about an hour of this back and forth, Daniel managed to bring the price down to $29,900, almost $2,000 below the sticker. And at that exact moment, something subtle but extremely important happened. The salesperson leaned back, changed his tone, and said something that instantly framed the outcome in Daniel's mind: "We're basically not making anything on this deal." And that sentence mattered far more than it seemed, because it didn't just communicate information, it validated the entire experience Daniel just went through. In Daniel's mind, everything aligned. He negotiated hard, the price dropped significantly, and now even the salesperson was confirming that the dealership wasn't really making money, which reinforced the belief that he had outperformed the system, that he had played the game correctly and won. And once that belief locked in, everything that followed was interpreted through that lens. He wasn't cautious anymore. He wasn't analyzing every detail, because as far as he was concerned, the important part was already done, the difficult part was behind him, and what remained was just paperwork. And this is where the story quietly shifts, because the part that costs people the most usually begins after they think the negotiation is over. Now, a few days later, Alex walks into that exact same dealership, sees the same car, sits down in the same type of chair, and enters what looks like the same process. But within the first few minutes, he says 5 words that completely change how the system responds to him. "I'm paying cash, best price." And in his mind, that statement represents strength, efficiency, and control, because in most situations, paying cash simplifies the transaction. It removes risk for the seller, eliminates financing delays, and often leads to better deals. So it feels like the smart move, the move that puts him in a stronger position before the negotiation even begins. But this is not most situations, and a dealership is not structured like a typical seller, because while Alex believes he is simplifying the deal, what he is actually doing is removing one of the most important profit channels available to the dealership. And the moment that happens, the system adjusts in a predictable way, the flexibility decreases, the willingness to move on price becomes more limited, and the negotiation becomes tighter, more controlled, and less dynamic. And after a shorter exchange, Alex agrees to pay $32,100, which is about $2,200 more than what Daniel paid for the exact same car, in the exact same place, within the exact same week. And he leaves feeling fine, not pressured, not misled, just satisfied that the process was straightforward and complete. That's the illusion. Because most expensive mistakes don't feel like mistakes, They feel like normal outcomes inside a system that was never designed to be obvious. Now, if you stop here, the explanation feels simple. Daniel negotiated better, Alex didn't. But that conclusion is incomplete because it assumes that the negotiation you see is the only negotiation that matters, and that assumption is exactly what allows the system to work. Because the visible part of the deal, the price of the car, is only one layer of a much larger structure, and it is often the least important one. Daniel won the negotiation and lost after it, while Alex lost before the negotiation even started, and both outcomes were driven not by skill alone, but by how their decisions interacted with the structure of the deal. When you walk into a dealership, you think you're negotiating the price of a product, but from the dealership's perspective, you're entering a multi-layered revenue system, where the price of the car is just the entry point, not the primary source of profit. And once you see how this is structured, the entire process starts to look different, because you're no longer focused only on the number in front of you, but on how that number is connected to everything that follows. This is where most buyers start looking at the wrong numbers. Let's start with the most visible number, the price of the car, because that is where almost all attention is focused. On a vehicle with a sticker price of around $31,800, the dealership's effective cost might be somewhere between $29,000 and $29,500, depending on manufacturer arrangements, internal pricing, and incentives. So when Daniel negotiates the price down to $29,900, it appears that the dealership is making a very small margin, which reinforces the idea that he pushed the deal close to its limit, while Alex, who pays $32,100, appears to be leaving a much larger margin on the table, which reinforces the idea that he simply did not negotiate as effectively. But that interpretation ignores what happens behind the scenes, because the dealership's real cost is often lower than the numbers buyers use as a reference point. Manufacturers frequently return money to dealerships after a vehicle is sold through incentive structures that are not visible to the customer. These can include percentage-based returns in the range of 2 to 3% of the vehicle's value, which on a car priced at around $31,800 translates to roughly $600 to $950 that flows back to the dealership after the deal is completed. There are also volume-based incentives tied to sales targets, where reaching certain thresholds within a month or quarter can trigger additional payouts that increase the effective profit per vehicle when averaged across all sales, meaning that what looks like a low-margin deal on the surface may still be part of a larger, highly profitable strategy when viewed from the dealership's perspective. And this is where the logic begins to shift, because the price you negotiate is not the final measure of the dealership's profit. It is simply the starting point, the visible layer that anchors your perception of the deal, while the more significant revenue streams remain largely out of sight. And this is where the deal actually changes. After Daniel agrees on the price, the dynamic shifts completely. The tension disappears, the interaction becomes calmer and more procedural, and Daniel's mindset changes with it. Because he believes the difficult part is over, he relaxes, his guard lowers, and he becomes more receptive to suggestions rather than resistant to them, which is exactly the transition the system is designed to create. The negotiation is over. The system is not. Daniel is then guided into the finance office, a separate environment with a different tone and a different role, where the person he speaks to is positioned not as a salesperson, but as someone who is there to finalize the deal and structure the financial details. And this distinction matters because it changes how Daniel interprets what follows. He is no longer negotiating. He is being guided through decisions that are framed as responsible and practical rather than optional. The finance manager begins presenting options in a calm and structured way, starting with the financing itself. Daniel is offered an interest rate of around 5%, which sounds reasonable and consistent with general expectations. But what he does not see is that the lender may have approved him at a lower rate, closer to 4%. And the difference between those two numbers represents margin, typically generating somewhere between $500 and $800 in additional profit for the dealership over the life of the loan. From there, the conversation moves to extended warranty coverage, which is framed as protection against future uncertainty in a way to avoid unexpected repair costs, with a price that might fall in the range of $1,200 to $1,500, which in isolation feels justified. But the actual cost to the dealership for that coverage is often significantly lower, leaving several $100s in embedded margin within what appears to be a prudent decision. Gap insurance is introduced next, and while it can provide real value in certain situations, particularly when a vehicle is financed with a low down payment, it also includes a margin that can add another $200 to $400 in profit, and because it is presented as a protective measure, it is rarely examined closely. Finally, smaller add-ons are layered into the conversation, such as tire protection, paint protection, and interior treatments, each individually priced in a way that feels minor relative to the overall transaction, often between $100 and $300, but each carrying its own margin, and when combined, these elements contribute several hundred additional dollars to the total profit generated from the deal. By the time Daniel completes the process, the dealership has generated not just the margin from the negotiated price, but an additional $2,000 to $3,000 through the finance office. And this is the point where the initial perception of a deal diverges most significantly from the reality of how it was structured, because Daniel still evaluates his success based on the price he negotiated, while the dealership evaluates its success based on the total structure of the transaction. This is what most people never see, and once you see it, the entire process starts to look different. If you step back and look at Daniel and Alex side by side, the difference between them stops looking like a question of intelligence or effort and starts looking like a difference in how the system responded to their behavior. Because both of them made decisions that felt logical in the moment. Both of them followed what they believed were smart strategies, and both of them left with a sense that nothing had gone obviously wrong. Yet one of them quietly gave back most of his advantage after the negotiation, while the other removed his advantage before the negotiation even began, and that shift in perspective is what changes how you need to think about this entirely. Most people approach a purchase like this as if it is a single decision. You pick the product, negotiate the price, and finalize the deal. But in reality, what you're stepping into is a sequence of connected decisions, each one tied to a different profit mechanism, and each one designed to feel independent, which is why it is so difficult to see the full picture while you are inside it, because you're not being asked to make one large, obvious decision. You're being guided through multiple smaller ones that feel reasonable on their own, but collectively shape the final outcome. Daniel's mistake was not that he negotiated poorly. In fact, on the surface, he did almost everything right. He researched, he compared, he pushed the price down, and he created the impression that he was in control of the situation. But what he failed to recognize is that the negotiation phase is only one part of the system, and it is not even the part where the majority of profit is generated. So by the time he relaxed, by the time he shifted from questioning to agreeing, he had already entered the phase where his previous advantage could be gradually reversed through decisions that felt justified at every step. Alex's mistake was different, and in some ways more subtle, because it happened before he had any chance to build leverage. By declaring that he was paying cash, he effectively removed the dealership's most flexible profit channel. And when that channel disappears, the system compensates in a predictable way by protecting its total margin through the only variable it can still control, the price of the car, which is why Alex encounters less flexibility during negotiation and ultimately agrees to a higher price, not because he lacked discipline, but because he unknowingly changed how the system evaluated him as a customer. This is where most buyers start asking the wrong question. The instinct is to ask how to negotiate better, how to push harder, how to get a lower number on the surface. But once you understand how this system is structured, the more useful question becomes how the system actually makes money. Because once you see that clearly, your behavior starts to align with the structure instead of working against it without realizing it. There are three core mechanisms that define how this process works. And once you see them, the entire deal becomes easier to understand and easier to control. The first mechanism is that the visible price is not the true profit center. It is the anchor that shapes your perception of the deal. And because it is the only number you actively negotiate, it creates the illusion that it is the most important one. But as you have already seen, the dealership's real margin is distributed across multiple layers, many of which are activated after the price is agreed upon. which means that focusing all your effort on the price while ignoring everything that follows leaves you exposed to the most profitable parts of the system. The second mechanism is that your perceived value as a customer changes based on how you intend to pay. And this is where Alex's situation becomes particularly important, because by announcing that he was paying cash, he unknowingly reclassified himself from a high-margin customer to a lower-margin one. And once that classification changes, the system adjusts its behavior accordingly, offering less flexibility on price because there are fewer opportunities to generate profit later in the process, which means that the idea of cash being universally advantageous is not only incomplete, but in this specific environment, it can work directly against you. The third mechanism is that the point at which you feel most comfortable is often the point at which you are least protected. And this is exactly what happened to Daniel, because once the price was agreed upon, he shifted mentally from negotiation to completion, from analysis to acceptance. And that shift is what allows the finance phase to generate significant additional profit, not through pressure, but through a sequence of decisions that feel individually reasonable, but collectively reshape the structure of the deal. Once you understand these three mechanisms, the strategy becomes clearer, and more importantly, it becomes simpler than most people expect. Because you're no longer trying to out-negotiate the system, you're adjusting your behavior to work within how it actually functions. The first step is to enter the process as a financing buyer, not because you intend to carry a loan long-term, but because that classification gives you access to the highest level of flexibility during the negotiation phase, when the dealership expects to generate additional profit through financing and related products. It is more willing to reduce the visible price of the car because it anticipates recovering that margin later, and you can use that expectation to your advantage. The second step is to negotiate the purchase price as if it were the only decision being made, because during this phase, that is the part of the system you are directly influencing, you focus on the number in front of you. You remain patient. And you avoid introducing information that reduces your perceived value as a customer, particularly anything that signals you will not participate in financing, because doing so limits the system's incentive to offer you a better deal. The third step is to shift your focus once the price is agreed upon. Instead of relaxing, you need to become more attentive, because this is the phase where the structure of the deal expands and where the majority of additional profit is generated. Every option presented to you should be evaluated independently, based on its actual value rather than how it is framed. Because while some of these products can be useful, their pricing often includes margins that can be negotiated or avoided. The fourth step is to examine the financing terms carefully, particularly the interest rate and any associated fees. Because this is where hidden margin is often embedded. You want to understand what rate you were approved for versus what rate you're being offered. And you want to confirm whether there are any penalties for early repayment, because this determines how much flexibility you have after the transaction is complete. The fifth step is to retain control after the deal is finalized. If you have structured the transaction in a way that maximizes your leverage during negotiation and confirm that there are no significant penalties for early repayment, you can choose to pay off the loan quickly, reducing or eliminating the long-term cost of interest while still benefiting from the lower purchase price that was made possible by the financing structure. This is where the structure starts working for you instead of against you. When you return to Daniel and Alex with this perspective, their outcomes stop being surprising and start being predictable. Daniel gained an advantage during the negotiation, but gave a significant portion of it back during the finance phase, while Alex removed his advantage before the negotiation even began and compensated for it with a higher upfront price. And in both cases, the system behaved exactly as it was designed to, responding to their inputs and preserving its overall profitability. The important shift is not in what they did, but in how they understood what they were doing, because once you see the system clearly, your decisions stop being isolated actions and start becoming part of a larger strategy. And that is the difference between feeling like you got a good deal and actually getting one. And this is where the lesson extends beyond this specific situation, because the same pattern appears in many areas of personal finance, where the visible cost is only one part of a larger structure, and where the way you engage with that structure determines how the cost is distributed. Whether it is loans, subscriptions, service agreements, or large purchases, the principle remains the same. The system is not optimized for simplicity. It is optimized for profitability, and unless you understand how that profitability is generated, you're making decisions inside a structure you cannot fully see. Most people focus on the obvious numbers, the price, the monthly payment, the visible fee, because those are the elements that are directly presented to them. But the real impact often comes from the less visible layers, the terms, the margins, and the incentives that shape how those numbers are constructed. And once you start paying attention to those layers, your perspective shifts from reacting to numbers to understanding how they are created. This is the shift that changes everything. Because in the end, the most important detail is not how much you paid, it is how the deal was structured. And if you get that part wrong, you could do everything else right and still end up losing money without ever realizing where it actually went. Because the money wasn't lost on the price. It was lost in the structure.